All right, so we just did, or we just learned classes and how to use them. And I feel like the gears are starting to click now. Like I'm starting to understand what the other or the prerequisites to this lesson and why it was important to learn all of those other things before we learned about classes. So I just wanted to kind of break down classes, and I wanted to kind of give somewhat of an explanation that I can go back and look at to kind of explain what classes are and what they basically mean. So we started here with introducing the classes and what they are. So the classes that we learned about here, I mean, I know there's a bunch of different classes in different languages, but JavaScript classes in particular are basically constructor functions, but they're easier to work with, and they're basically just a cleaner way to work with constructor functions and the prototype. So if we start off with this first code, it basically just says, yeah, classes are basically constructor functions. And there's languages like React and Angular that have adopted classes and made full use of them. I haven't gotten there yet, but I'll just take the video's word for it. So basically, to declare a class, it's very similar to a constructor function. So with the constructor function, we use the function keyword and we use a capital letter and then the name of the function we want to create. And classes are really similar. So instead of using the function keyword, I think we use the class keyword. So we can say class and then capital S student and then the body tags, and that's how we create a class. Something else that's different about classes compared to functions is that we don't use the parentheses in front of the function name. So in front of the class student, there's no parentheses. So moving on, having our methods, create our methods directly in the class body. So yeah, I want to explain this too. So before, when we were working with constructors, so if we go back here and then we go back again, the way that we would add a method into our constructor function right here, here's our constructor function. The way we would add a method is by having to access the constructor function's prototype and then using the dot notation to add the function's name. So here it's greeting, and then to create a function. And then we're basically just saying log out, welcome back, this, so student dot name. So whatever name is passed through the argument. So that's how we created a prototype for the student constructor function. But what's different about the class is that we don't have to do this. Instead, we can just write it directly in the body of the class. And that is one thing that just makes working with classes a lot easier. So since we can't include anything inside of parentheses in classes, the way we would be able to give our values, or our objects, created by our classes, key value pairs, is by using the constructor method. So the constructor method is not an array method. I'm not sure if it's an object method, but it's a method, and we can basically use the this keyword and use it how we would use a regular function construction. So as we see here, we have constructor, we have the ID, name, subjects, which is a default parameter of an array, and we just say this.id is the ID, this.the name is the name, this.the subjects is the subjects. And one thing that I wanted to point out before I moved on from here is that these statements here, these are actually called instance properties. So when we say this.id equals ID, that's an instance property. And the argument is returned to us when we create a new instance of the class, which is going to be an object called student1, and When we call, of course, we use the new keyword just like construction functions, and then we run in our arguments. So one for ID, read for name, and then subjects gets the default parameter. Okay, so moving on. I think we just explained a few of these actually. Yep. So these are instance properties, and then this is the constructor method, and that's us filling it. This is us calling it. So something that's actually different about classes that I should really talk about is if you don't use the new keyword, you'll actually get an error. So cannot call a class constructor without new. So this is different from the constructor functions, because if we do the same thing with the constructor functions, if we remove the new, it'll still work. So something that could happen is that we expect our code to work in a certain way and it doesn't. So that's something that classes also fixes that constructor functions can't fix. Okay. And that's explaining that. Okay, so something else that's different is that when we're creating regular objects, like let's say Nelly, and we'll turn that into an object, and then we say name Nelly, age 21. We use commas in between every single element or key value pair that we include inside of our object. But this is different for classes because they actually don't require any commas. And this is a common mistake when people start to work with classes, is that they believe that, or they accidentally insert commas, even though classes don't require commas. So that's something to watch out for in the future. So moving on. So basically now we want to think back for a second, and we want to see where we would expect the method declared on our class to be. So by the method, I mean like add subject. So where do you expect add subject to be? And if we console.log the prototype, so we can take the prototype of the student ID and we can run an add subject, we'll basically see that the prototype is within the parent element or the student class. So moving on. And now we can cover how to call our constructors, or call our methods that's inside of our classes. So in this example, we created a student. One is the ID, read is the name, and then this is the method get student name, which will return to us a student, and then the this.name. So when we console.log it, we can use the object instance that we just created, the student one, and then we can get the student name. So call that method with the dot notation, and it'll return to us student read. And something that's cool about this is because we're using the this, every student, like if we created a student 2 and we named her Sally, and we say student2.get student name, we'll get student Sally. So because we're using the this, it's going to the student. So it's basically like saying student.name. And then when we create the instance of the object or of the class, student1 is basically being replaced here for this .name. So the name read is connected to this object, and the name Sally is connected to this object. So that's something that I wanted to point out. Okay, so I think that is pretty much it. One thing I want to explain here is this code right here. So add subject. Add subject is working similarly to how it's always worked. We're saying this dot subjects. So we're grabbing the subjects created in our constructor, and then we're going to equal it to a clone of that same exact subject. So this is the array literal syntax, and then we are going to create a new array and clone the this.subjects. So we're modifying the subjects and we're adding a new subject with the parameter, and this is basically just adding a string to the end of the subject. And what we know about that is that it's just going to add a new element when we use this array literal syntax. So when we call student1.addSubject, we can add science, we can add history, and when we log it out, we get science and history. So that's pretty much it for for classes, my bad. And these are some of the things that you want to, some of the technical terms that you want to remember. So to insinuate. So to insinuate is basically the same or very similar to an instance. So when we insinuate an object is when we we create the object from the class that's insinuating it, which is kind of similar to an instance of it. So the double underscore prototype property is the dunder proto that we went over. So that basically lets us see the scope of all of our objects that we have created. So the scope or the dunder proto of student1 is student, and if we chain it twice, the dunder proto of student1 would be the global object. And then we have prototypical inheritance. This just means each of the created elements from the constructor function inherits from the constructor's prototype. Okay, this basically means that all of these methods are being pushed down to our objects to be able to be used by our objects created from the class. So I think that's pretty much it for classes. This is really starting to click for me and I'm pretty excited about it, but we'll just keep on practicing because repetition is key.